that's out there. Like you said, they've dusted off the Athenian democracy, but then blended it with more modern Enlightenment thought, John Locke and others. And let's give it a go.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's look at a second excerpt. This is the part that some people think is the beginning. This is probably the most quoted part and the most famous part of the entire Declaration. It's quoted in the Hamilton musical, so a whole new generation of kids could probably rap this out. But anyway, so not all of it, but anyway, so here we go. He says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Okay, so I already touched upon the idea of self-evident. Oh man, Scott, this idea of all men are created equal. And when Jefferson says men here, he means all people. He doesn't mean just males, all males. Although women would probably, it's easy to argue that he probably didn't think women were completely equal to men, because it's going to take a long time for women to gain, for example, the right to hold property, the right to vote.
140 years or so.
I know, right. But anyway, nevertheless, this is a big step, because what he's saying here is that you don't have commoners and nobility. You don't have, in Britain, and this lasted a long time, long past 1776, but the idea that certain people were better than others. They were given a higher station in society than by God. So you had your commoners, your nobility, and people would have to do things like take off. If you were a commoner, you were supposed to take off your hat when one of the nobles came by. Britain has lords and ladies and earls and dukes and all that. And they were considered to actually be better. He's saying, no, we're not going to have that in America. He probably means white males at this point, but that's still a major step, Scott, forward in human history, that you're not going to have some white men that are better than others who have a title or something like that. Anyway, could go on all day about that. And it's still a very controversial passage. Jefferson has been called on the carpet for being a hypocrite, because here he is a slaveholder. It's holding, a large number of slaves, a couple hundred, give or take. The number changed from time to time. But here he is holding people in bondage and saying all men are created equal. But we'll pass over that.
Yeah, listen to our Civil War series where we dwell more on how that people tried unsuccessfully to square that circle and how it was ultimately resolved.
Yeah, it will be partially solved in the 1860s, but
partially, yeah.
Partially, yes, not completely for much longer. And some would say it still hasn't been solved completely.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
Everybody is given unalienable rights. In other words, rights that cannot be taken away by their Creator, by God. So again, government doesn't come from God, but equality and certain basic human rights do come from God. And he sums them up by saying life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He's taken that phrase from Locke. Locke had talked about life, liberty, and property, but Jefferson broadens that third one. So it's not just property. I mean, property's great, but property might not be what everybody wants. He thinks everybody should have the right to pursue happiness, to have the freedom to do the things that they want to do, to have a fulfilling life. No one can take these rights away. So the first task of government is to make these rights secure. All right. Any thoughts on that?
Like you said, there are a million other things we could look at, but
I know. We could do a whole series just on this passage here, but let's not.
Let's not forget that the Declaration of Independence, it undergirds all of the American constitutional philosophy, but most of it is really complaining against a man who's been dead for over 200 years. So let's get into the complaints against this poor, unfortunate man.
Yeah. So again, this has all been prelude. Now Jefferson gets into the meat of the problem. I'm leading up to it, but now I'm going to tell you specifically all the grievances that we have with King George and the British government. What exactly has he been doing that has driven us to this need to declare ourselves independence. So he starts out by saying, the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations. In other words, he's been taking things away from us, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So it's almost like he's an attorney. Jefferson was a lawyer by background, but he didn't really practice law for very long. But he's going to lay out the evidence. And most of these statements start out with he has. So it's a long sequence of he has. He has done this. He has done that. Let's look at a few of them. Not all of them, obviously. One of them is he has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. So what is he talking about here? He's talking about how the royal governors had a bad tendency to dissolve the colonial legislatures when they didn't like what they were doing. And so he's saying we established these legislatures to run our affairs, and yet your representatives, O king, have been destroying is the word that came to mind, but just kind of messing with. Basically, the king is interfering with their right to govern themselves. Next, and I'm not going in strict order, but here's another one that was a really big beef. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. So he's referring in one case to the army that was sent into Boston in 1768 to keep the peace, the Redcoats. Normally, armies didn't get sent unless there was already a war going on, but that was broken during the period of unrest in the late 1760s, early 1770s. And as we will see, if you know American history, you'll know that throughout the early part of American history, the idea of a standing army was a big bugaboo. It was something that almost everybody was afraid of. They didn't want an army, and that's why the U.S. Army is just going to be tiny, tiny, tiny for a very, very long time. And Scott, that doesn't really change until after World War II. It's not until after World War II when the President Truman makes a major change and decides we're going to keep a big army because we've got a lot of responses we have to make, things we have to respond to throughout the world. But prior to that, the army is going to be very, very small. And whenever we go to war, we're always going to be grossly unprepared until the early 1950s anyway.
So an early American would be very confused at our celebration of the military today, I would guess.
Jefferson would have, if he could be brought back to life, he would immediately die again because he would have a heart attack when he saw that we have, I don't know what's the size of our military, several million around the world, and we've got ships and planes and tanks and everything, he would go nuts. But again, the fear was that a big army would be used to put down rebellions and to enforce tyranny upon the population. So that's what that's about. Another one, he has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. And I'm sitting here thinking, oh, just you wait. He hasn't even gotten started yet. Next time, he is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages. Okay, I love that.
Those Hessians, man, they're a rough crowd.
And totally unworthy of the head of the civilized nation. So, okay, Jefferson's going over the top here a little bit, don't you think, Scott? I mean, he sends a few thousand Hessians and he's saying, this is scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages.
He's trying to sell his point, so it's salesmanship right here, pure and simple.
Yeah, I mean, he knows that most of the people reading this are not going to have a PhD in history and can say, oh, well, what about this time? Or, what about the Mongols? Or what about this or that? And then the last one I want to quote is, in every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. So again, Jefferson, if I could paraphrase, he's saying we've asked and asked and asked. We've sent petition after petition trying to get some relief. And he said, nope, sorry. And so he's saying that King George is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. So that's the major section. That's probably the least quoted and least known section by the average American, at least even Americans who know their history. But that's really, again, the meat of it. Those are the reasons why we are taking the plunge.
All right. Well, one thing that I would like to note with the Declaration, this doesn't add to the ideas behind it, but you mentioned earlier that the draft committee of 5 people, most notably 2, Benjamin Franklin, or 3, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, there's a reason that Jefferson was tasked with writing the document. Part of it, he was known as erudite and an excellent writer, and that is true. But the other reason is that, and I love this, the other founding fathers were afraid that if Benjamin Franklin wrote it, then he would try to sneak a joke into it. And he,
I've never heard that.
And he had, for decades, when I mentioned earlier, he was a teenager. He wrote under pseudonyms like Silence Dogood. According to Ormond Seavey, who's an editor of Oxford's edition of Ben Franklin's autobiography, when they were deciding who should write the Declaration of Independence, they chose Jefferson over Franklin, who at the time, Franklin was more qualified, more respected. He was highly respected as probably one of the best known writers in the colonies. But they thought that he would sneak in some type of joke or turn a phrase, or, well, it's Franklin, so it'd probably be a sexual innuendo.
Yeah, I was going to say it was going to be something dirty.
But then people wouldn't realize it was in there until years or maybe decades after the fact. And they knew at the time that this is something that's going to be sent to the nations of the world and read very closely. So that's why they chose. And if you look at some of Franklin's other writings, he is very funny. He has one article he wrote called How to Select a Mistress. It's almost like a logical treatise on 12 points, like a parody of Common Sense. He's stating why you should choose a middle age over a younger mistress for, you do not have the risk of a bastard child. You do not have XYZ. And then finally his reason is, lastly, because she is so grateful. So I see exactly why they didn't have Franklin write it if he has other stuff like that floating around.
All right. Yes. So that's very interesting. I'm glad you pointed that out. Franklin, you got to watch him every minute.
Oh,
He's
yeah.
sneaky. All right. So we come to the conclusion now. And this is, in my opinion, at least, not as well known as the introduction, but better known than the middle part with the grievances. But here we go. I'm going to quote this in full. So it's long, but it's worth quoting. So they say, "We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America," and by the way, the United is not capitalized. It's kind of interesting. But anyway, "We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." Oh, I love that last part, Scott. That just sends chills down my spine.
Yeah.
I'm going to read that. Can I read that again?
Please.
"We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." And this wasn't just flowery language, Scott. They weren't just using hyperbole or just trying to sound highfalutin. I keep coming back to that word. But anyway.
It's Texas where you're recording from,
yeah,
so it's fair.
Yeah, sure. Got to use some Texas words. But they really were pledging their lives. If the guys that signed this document, if the revolution were put down, we know what would have happened to them. The British government didn't mess around with traitors. They would have, in most cases, probably been hung by the neck until dead. So they really were pledging their lives and their fortunes. Even the ones that weren't killed probably would have gone to prison for the rest of their lives. They would have had their property taken away. And then the concept of honor is so important, and we'll talk about this more throughout the series. But a